Good evening, everyone. You must be tired of me always saying what a special night it is, but truly, this is a special night, right? This is 75th anniversary of the Buffalo Philharmonic. Amazing night. You know, I was talking to people in a group earlier that I like to think about that we're applauding not only the musicians who are sitting on stage tonight, but the thousands and thousands of musicians who sat in these chairs and made great music happen in this hall for 70 years, as if their music is still somehow in the walls. I like to think about this, that they all were a big part of getting us to our 75th anniversary. And what we truly celebrate, too, besides all of these wonderful musicians now and of the past, were people like yourselves sitting in Kleinhans Music Hall, believing in the orchestra, taking care of the orchestra, applauding and knowing how important music is to our lives. So it's a big celebration of you tonight, and we're all very excited. I'll tell you a little bit about the opening and closing piece, but before we do that, we have a chance to have a special guest. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, I think we have done it maybe in the last 10 years 4 or 5 times. So I almost don't have to tell you much about it, but I like to remind you a little bit about Tchaikovsky and how difficult things were in his life when he wrote this, because this piece was kind of a coming back to himself. He had had a very difficult time in which he ill-advisedly entered into a marriage with a young student, Antonina Milyukova. And this young student pursued him, and he finally said yes, and he longed for family life, but it wasn't right for Tchaikovsky. And 9 weeks into the marriage, he fled. And he turned to the person who was truly his best friend in the world, Madame Nadezhda von Meck. You've heard this name before. Madame von Meck was a very wealthy widow, the widow of a railroad magnate in Russia, and he left her an immense fortune. And she heard at one point in her life someone playing Tchaikovsky music on piano, some of his piano pieces, and she just thought, this is unbelievable music. I want to help this composer. She wrote to him. She offered him a stipend with no strings attached. He could write whatever he wanted, just so that he wouldn't have to worry about earning a living. He could write as a composer. But there was one stipulation, and that was that he never meet her, and he never did. But they became incredibly close, and you could read the very intimate letters that they exchanged, in which Tchaikovsky told her things he told nobody else, including his troubles with his mistaken marriage, and when she knew how unhappy he was, she sent him the money to leave and to go to Switzerland and to try and come back to life. And in coming back to life, he found himself again, and he wrote this incredible piece. So what an immensely important piece for him, spiritually, emotionally, to be able to write this. He wrote it for the greatest violinist in Russia at the time, Leopold Auer. Whose name you might know, but Leopold Auer said it was totally unplayable. And not only did he refuse to play it, even though it was dedicated to him, he actually campaigned against it. He told his students, "No, you must not touch this piece. It's not written for the violin. It's impossible. You can't do it." So no violinist in Russia would attempt it. 4 years later, Adolf Brodsky finally agreed to play it, but he didn't dare play it in Russia because Leopold Auer was there. He played it in Vienna. And the reviews were very bad. As I've told you before, Tchaikovsky probably wins the prize for the worst reviews of any composer. And the most important critic in Vienna wrote this, Edward Hanslick, a name that you might know. Edward Hanslick was a very great fan of Brahms. So, of course, Brahms and Tchaikovsky were very different sides of the musical coin. So this is what Hanslick wrote about the world premiere. The Russian composer Tchaikovsky has neither discrimination nor taste, as is illustrated by his latest long and pretentious violin concerto. Vulgarity has the upper hand. The violin is not played, it is pulled at, torn, and beaten. The finale reminds us of the brutal and wretched jollity of a Russian drinking party. We can plainly see the savage faces. We can hear the curses. We can even smell the vodka. Tchaikovsky's violin concerto proves for the first time that there can be music that stinks to the ear. And I always like to read that because to remind you that pieces that we love now and couldn't live without at one time were not enjoyed by the audience. And it seems amazing, but Auer eventually changed his mind, Leopold Auer, and he did a great favor for Tchaikovsky. He was too old at that point to play the piece, but he taught it to a very important person. He taught it to his best student, Jascha Heifetz. And Jascha Heifetz then championed this piece all of his life. So maybe it's thanks to Auer, after all, that we hear it because of Jascha Heifetz playing it. And we have one of the greatest violinists of our time here to play it tonight. And I am so delighted that Midori has agreed to come out and say hello and say a few words. Let's welcome Midori. Midori, we're so happy that you came out. We interrupted her in the middle of practicing. She's practicing some very fierce contemporary music back there. I don't know if you know that Midori is not only an incredible advocate for standard repertoire, but she's become one of the leading proponents of new music. And she told me before that one of the problems about being so interested in new music is that every composer is writing something for you.
Well, I'm very, very lucky and fortunate that composers like me and they decide to write to me. So I'm always intrigued learning new pieces, something that has never been ever played. And it's just such an exciting process to start giving it a life and to start creating this path of tradition for any piece of work. Sometimes, these pieces, like with Tchaikovsky Concerto, as a player, I don't like it as much, and I feel like, oh, goodness, I don't know if I want to play this. But then, usually they grow on me, and I end up liking them very much, and by the end of the process of the initial learning, I'm usually a very good advocate.
Always a very good advocate, and I can imagine why composers are writing this sometimes really extraordinarily challenging work for you. And I agree with Midori. Sometimes for me also it's the pieces that seem not comfortable at the beginning, or I can't really understand them, and I'm not sure I like them. Those are the ones that I come to love. At a certain point, and they stay with me my whole life. The ones that take a little time to get to know. So we were talking, as you heard, that Leopold Auer said, this is unplayable, it's not music. And, you've played it all your life. What do you think?
Well, I think this is a wonderful work. Certainly, as you said, and you've played it, you've done it so many times here in Buffalo, it is one of the most popular concertos for instrument. And it is very challenging in many different ways. Technically and musically and all kinds of things, but it's the elegance, it's the sheer elegance and the colors and the textures that is so uniquely Tchaikovsky. And of course, Tchaikovsky only wrote one concerto for us. It's not like the piano concertos. And so we violinists really cherish this work.
You know what, I love the word you used, Midori, because we heard about them saying how savage and brutal this was. And you used the word elegant, and it is, and you'll hear, every interpretation of Tchaikovsky Concerto is a little different, but you bring a great deal of elegance and a kind of internal beauty to it and purity that is your concept of it. So it is. I think Tchaikovsky would have been very vindicated that it's not brutal. It's filled with fire, but it's very elegant and sheerly beautiful. When did you first play it? How old were you when you first tackled this?
Well, I think learning it was something I did very early on. I would say I actually remember playing this for my teacher, Dorothy DeLay, the first summer I met her at Aspen, and I was at that point, I think 9. So I had played it the year before, studying it with my mother, and I had brought it into Aspen for my first study abroad.
There are not many 8-year-olds who can play the Tchaikovsky violin. Yes, amazing, amazing. And since then you've played it many times. Just tell us one more thing. As you play it year after year, does your concept of it change?
Oh, absolutely. I think every performance feels different. Even if it's a repeat performance with the same orchestra, same conductor, same hall, say that in a subscription set, we're playing it 3 times. Each time is different. It may not be drastically different, but it is different. Something is just unique on every performance, every stage, every concert, and you just hear certain different things, or you respond differently to what you've always heard, and so your reactions, this chain of reactions, which really is very closely connected to interpretation, to the process of it, really is ongoing, and it never ceases to just stop. And it keeps going and going and going and on and on and on.
It was wonderful for me to sense this too. We rehearsed it yesterday and we rehearsed it today. And even between those 2 rehearsals, it was different. And it was like playing chamber music with Midori, where everyone had their ears open, listening to what she was doing. You were also listening to our wind players, our string players. And it was different, and it's so delightful. So I'm not sure if everyone in the audience is aware that when we're playing, it's so flexible and so fluid. As many times as we might have played a piece, it's never the same. And tonight will be different from this morning. So I'm going to let Midori go back and rest, or go back to her practicing of her contemporary
I have to get changed, as we can see. I'm still in my street clothes, so thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm very grateful for her for spending a few minutes with us. She is an amazing player, an amazing musical citizen, an advocate for composers, an advocate for students. She's a terrific human being as well. We're starting the concert with the very first piece ever played by the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra under Maestro Schuch, Beethoven Egmont Overture. Now, this must have been a piece that he loved dearly, and I'm sure that's why he chose it for his first program. But it does seem appropriate because it's a piece about strength and courage and starting on a journey, which the Buffalo Philharmonic was at that point. And Beethoven was a perfect choice of a composer. Beethoven, our most beloved composer. He's the person that to us is always the most real. You know, we sense Beethoven's struggles, we sense his emotion, we sense his drama, we sense that he cares about us somehow in his music. And in this piece you will feel that too. Beethoven started to write it in 1809 on a commission from the Vienna Theater. The Vienna Theater had decided to remount plays by Schiller and by Goethe. 2 poets very dear to Beethoven's heart. You, of course, remember Schiller was the poet who wrote the Ode to Joy. The words of the Ninth Symphony were written by Schiller. And the theater then chose a group of composers, and Beethoven had actually asked for Schiller, who he was very, very fond of at the time. He wanted to write the incidental music to Schiller's play William Tell, based on William Tell. But the theater turned him down. They said, no, we're giving that to somebody else. We want you to do Goethe Egmont, the story of Egmont. And so Beethoven said yes, and he wasn't unhappy. He was a tremendous fan of Goethe. In fact, he said he'd read him and admired him a lot, and he said in his Beethoven way, he said, I would have gone to my death, yes, 10 times to my death for Goethe. And he meant it. He was a tremendous fan of this poet. And Egmont's theme really appealed to Beethoven because Beethoven was a revolutionary. I mean, he was living in a time of revolution, and he was the greatest musical revolutionary that we have, not only in terms of his music, forcing us into the Romantic period, which he did. He just pushed us into Romanticism, but also in terms of how he felt about himself as a composer. Before Beethoven, composers were servants. They worked for a duke, they worked for a wealthy household, they worked for the church. They were servants. Beethoven refused to live as a servant. He was an artist. And he forced the world to recognize artists as individual people. He did that pretty much single-handedly. So this idea of a story about the downfall of tyranny would have appealed to him a great deal. So he wrote music for the play more than this. First the overture came, and then there were several pieces between the acts, entr'actes. There were a couple of songs for Clairchen, who was the sweetheart of Egmont, Count Egmont, and then a symphony, a little piece at the end too. But of all of that music, which sometimes played with the narration, it the overture is overwhelmingly the most popular. And the play is based upon a 16th century Count Egmont. He's a Netherlandish patriot. He lives in the Netherlands, and at that time, as was often the case in Europe, countries would change ownership, and Spain was trying to take over the Netherlands. Philip II was trying to turn the Netherlands into a Spanish colony, and Count Egmont resisted fiercely. He was captured, unfortunately, and beheaded. But he was a great hero, remains a great hero to the people of the Netherlands. And Goethe loved this story, and he took a little poetic license. He said that, Egmont was perhaps a little bit of a rake in terms of his real history, but Goethe didn't portray him in that way, and he said, we are poets, we're not historians, and he's absolutely right. So he took a little bit of license with the character of Egmont. But Beethoven carried this another step further with this wonderful music. The overture opens very solemnly in F minor. This is a very dark key because of these ominous events that are coming. And actually, it's a kind of an unusual opening. It's in 3. If you think about it, it's a Spanish saraband. It's written like a Spanish saraband to give you the idea that perhaps that this is the Spanish conquistadors who are coming to take over the Netherlands, and he sets up this very dark opening. Then the orchestra starts moving. You'll recognize it's a very, very tumultuous and action-filled piece. But it comes to an end suddenly. There's a quiet little section in the woodwinds. This is probably the moment of Egmont's death. And everything stops. And then we hear slowly, softly at first, building up in the orchestra, this great explosion of joy in F major. This is very different than it started. Why would Beethoven do that? Well, he really believed that what Egmont stood for went far beyond the circumstances of his life. And Goethe had added in his story about Egmont that Egmont is visited by his deceased sweetheart, Kleinhans, in prison. And Kleinhans tells him that although he's going to die, his death will be the spark of a revolution that will eventually bring victory to the Netherlands. So Egmont goes to his death knowing that his country will be saved. And that's the end. It's a fantastic ending of great hope, great victory. Even though the hero has been killed, he's given his life for his country, something that Beethoven admired enormously. So it's very moving for us to play this piece that was played so many years ago. I hope you find that too. It's a wonderful way to start our season. Then we're playing a piece that we have loved working on, and some of you may have heard it before. It's a piece by Prokofiev, his Cinderella. Now, many of us grew up with the Charles Perrault fairy tales, either reading them or seeing the Disney version of all these fairy tales. Collectively, Charles Perrault fairy tales have inspired an enormous quantity of music. People have written music based upon his stories, more than any other literature, with the exception maybe of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. That has also inspired a great amount of music. But there's a lot of diverse pieces based upon, especially Cinderella, which is the favorite of the Charles Perrault tales. Rossini, Massenet, Wolf-Ferrari, Eric Coates, many, many others. But perhaps the most beautiful is this ballet by Prokofiev, and that's what we're playing tonight. It's very Russian, and it's very romantic, and this is a product of Prokofiev's mature period. He was writing at the top of his game, and he was writing this, dedicating it to the memory of Tchaikovsky, of course, the great ballet composer, Tchaikovsky. So Prokofiev is writing it in his honor. He worked on it between 1941 and 1944. The premiere was given in Moscow, and the first season after the war was ended. At the same time, Prokofiev was writing his Fifth Symphony, so this is a very, very powerful time for Prokofiev in terms of his artistic output. So you listen to it, you might hear little echoes of the Fifth Symphony in it because it was already in his head. As a young man, Prokofiev was really a rebel, and he wrote music, as some of you know, is very spiky, very dissonant, daring harmonically, brutal rhythms, really music intended to shock people. But when he came back to the Soviet Union after being away for 15 years in the West, he lived outside of the Soviet Union, he came back in 1933, he really embraced his culture again, the Russianness and this kind of direct communication. And he wrote pieces, as I said, like the Fifth Symphony, this ballet, his second violin concerto, very beautiful piece, the ballet Romeo and Juliet, also very beautiful. This piece, for some reason, of all of those, is the least known. It's not often played. I hope you'll agree that that's just incomprehensible because the music is so beautiful, and some of his biographers have felt that this is actually an even more beautiful, better ballet than Romeo and Juliet, which is a staggering ballet. That's quite a compliment to him, and he would have liked that because he really loved this ballet and he felt it was very Russian, and he wanted it to be very Russian because he'd just come back home. He'd come back to his homeland, and he said these are his words. He says, "I know that Cinderella is a tale that is found among many people." And that's true all over the world. But I wanted to present it as a genuine Russian fairy story. The Russians have always loved Cinderella. But 200 years before Prokofiev's ballet, there were all kinds of pieces in Russia written about Cinderella, or Zolushka, that's the name of the Russian Cinderella, Zolushka, pantomimes, operas, all about this wonderful story. And Russians, as you know, have a fierce pride in their ballet. They have a fierce national pride. And Prokofiev took that into account when he was writing that he did all the right things in the grand old tradition of ballet. There were always certain pieces, certain types of pieces, certain solos, certain duets. He put all of that into this, and it was an immediate hit. Now, it had actually been commissioned by the Kirov Ballet in 1940, and Prokofiev started it, but he was interrupted by the war. The war began, and he felt he should really set it aside to write more serious things. He wrote War and Peace, his opera War and Peace. He wrote the film for Eisenstein's film, music for the film Ivan the Terrible. But then he went back to it in 1943. But a change had happened. He was writing it for a particular ballerina who was going to dance Cinderella, Galina Ulanova. She was one of the most famous of the great, great Russian ballerinas. And she was originally with the Kirov, but by the time Prokofiev went back to it, she had moved to the Bolshoi. So there was no way anybody else was going to dance this except Galina. So Prokofiev then gave the music to the Bolshoi, and the Bolshoi did the premiere. Rossini, when he was writing the opera, the other people wrote operas about Cinderella, sometimes ignored the supernatural elements, but Prokofiev didn't. In fact, he enhanced the supernatural elements in the story in a very dramatic way, and partly this was because of the ballet. He could use it in a way to really enhance the ballet. For instance, when the clock strikes 12, midnight, and Cinderella has to flee, he had a wonderful scene where 12 dwarfs, or children, young ballet students, jumped out of a clock and did a tap dance. So that's not in the Charles Perrault story, but it's really served the ballet very well. And Prokofiev decided that maybe one fairy wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to have the fairy godmother. He actually had 4 fairies, the fairy of summer, spring, winter, and fall, the 4 seasons. And they played their roles and they danced. You can imagine this is all very, very beautiful choreography, in terms of choreography and also costumes and scenery. And then one other wonderful, wonderful thing is that when the prince loses Cinderella, he searches for her all over the world in a single night. I mean, talking about these supernatural elements. The prince circles the world in a single night, and he stops in Spain, he stops in the Orient, he stops in the tropics, trying to slip her on the feet of all of these girls all over the world. So you can, again, imagine what that looked like in the ballet with the costumes and the setting. So Prokofiev took advantage of that. Of course, the prince then discovers his Cinderella right back in his own village. But by accident, when he's in her home and the second slipper falls out of her pocket, I think is the original story, and he realizes it's her. And Prokofiev said something I think is so sweet. He said, "By this small detail, I wanted to show how, in search of some ideal, people often pass by their own princesses." So she was right there at home all along. Prokofiev, what you hear is a suite drawn from the ballet. Prokofiev actually drew himself 3 different suites. I've put them together in a certain order, so you hear excerpts from all the different suites. This is all from the ballet. I'll tell you just quickly what they are. The introduction is quite short, but it's the music that he intended to be the depiction of Cinderella. It's very dark and has 2 aspects: the mistreated Cinderella, an unhappy Cinderella, but the Cinderella who's very beautiful and who's joyful nonetheless. The 2 sides of Cinderella in the introduction. That goes right into a funny little movement called the Duet of the Sisters. The 2 sisters in Russian are Kudishka and Kubishka. Kudishka is skinny, and Kubishka means dumpy in Russian. So there's the 2 stepsisters, skinny and dumpy in Russian. And you'll hear them in the second movement. They're fighting with each other a little bit, and they're fighting over a shawl. I think in the ballet is usually done. They're fighting over the shawl. They're pulling it back and forth, and eventually they rip it at the end of the second movement. The third movement that we chose is their dancing lesson. When they decided they are going to this ball, they're very excited. They bring in a dancing teacher, and they're grimly trying to learn how to dance, and they're completely graceless. And this is a little funny because the skinny and dumpy, are represented by Michael and Amy in the first chair. And so they're playing this duet, and you see it's totally just like grim. I mean, they're going to learn these steps no matter what. So when you hear them playing the duet, that's the stepsisters taking their dancing lesson. The fourth movement is the depiction of the fairy godmother. Fifth movement is Cinderella arriving at the ball, and we create in this orchestra setting the most ethereal, magical atmosphere. Cinderella late at night arriving at the ball, and she goes inside to the castle, and you hear the first of 2 unbelievable waltzes. This first waltz is her observing everything that's going on. It's a very dark waltz. I mean, Prokofiev has an element of in the Cinderella that is beautiful, but also very menacing too. And you'll see what I mean by that. It's kind of like a film noir Cinderella. You'll hear this waltz. It's an incredibly beautiful waltz, but there's definitely an underpinning of something very dark going on. That waltz ends, and then the prince sees her, and we hear Cinderella's waltz. And there are a few pieces more beautiful than this waltz that Prokofiev wrote for the prince and Cinderella dancing together. It is extraordinary. So that's the second waltz that you hear. That's interrupted, that beautiful waltz is interrupted by midnight. And you'll hear the wood block in the percussion section ticking out the seconds. And then you hear Dinesh playing the chimes, the 12 chimes, and Cinderella is gone. The next movement, the prince finds Cinderella. This is very romantic ending, and you'll hear some of Prokofiev's greatest love music. And then at the very end, we do a little reprise of Cinderella's waltz as they waltz off together. We couldn't resist playing this waltz one more time, so we put it at the end. You'll hear a little reprise. But it's truly beautiful music, and I hope you follow the story a little bit. We've had a lot of pleasure in putting it on this opening night. And again, I want to thank you for being here. One other thing I should say, because I brought it out to show you specifically, there is something very extraordinary that came out yesterday. And so many of you know all of the previous music directors here, that this is something I have to tell you about. This is a CD set, 5 CDs of all of the music directors, starting with William Steinberg, Joseph Cripps, going through Max, going through Semyon, all their concerts with the Buffalo Philharmonic. Ed Judzinski, whom you know, our beloved program annotator and historian, was the artistic director of this project. He and I went through countless performances to come up with what we thought was the best of what we had from our previous music directors, and pieces that were important to them, like Semyon conducting Shostakovich 5. Some of you here probably have heard Semyon conduct Shostakovich 5. Unbelievable. Max conducting Mozart. Joseph Cripps conducting Glenn Gould. Glenn Gould in this hall. I mean, Emperor Concerto. Michael Tilson Thomas conducting Sarah Vaughan. in Gershwin songs. This is unbelievable. I can't even, I talk about it, I get emotional because of the material that's in here. This is a sort of a sonic history of the best of what we could find to put on 5 CDs. We could have made many more, but we limited it to 5. And it's such an important part of our history. So we've never done anything like this, but if you remember many of these performances, this is something that you don't want to miss, this 5 CD set. So happy anniversary to all of us together, and thanks for being here.